Now, if you have a look at those verses at the end of 1 Kings chapter 5, it speaks about the preparations that Solomon was beginning to put into building this temple. And as you move on into chapter 6, you'll see that it was a strange thing. Struck me as strange, because chapter 6 verse 1 says it was in the 480th year after the Israelites had come out of Egypt that Solomon actually began to build this temple. Doesn't that strike you as strange, that it was 480 years after God got together a corporate people and began to move them into a land, took all of that time to begin to get this building work started, to have a dwelling place where he could live and be seen to live amongst his people? Why 480 years? Why did it take so long? And I believe that the key to that is back in the previous chapter, in chapter 5. We're going to be flicking backwards and forwards in 5 and 6 here. Chapter 5, verse 3, Solomon had this to say. He says, "We know that because of the wars waged against my father David from all sides, he couldn't build a temple for the name of the Lord his God until the Lord put his enemies under his feet." And I believe that that's what God was waiting for a period of peace. When the enemies of God's people had been subdued, then the temple could start to be built. Couldn't happen in David's time because he was a man of war. Couldn't have happened in any of the preceding generations because they were periods of war. But we come to a time in the history of God's people when the enemies have finally been subdued and there is a period of peace so that the temple can be built. I believe that ties in with the New Testament because Jesus said, didn't he, that he had been given keys, and he in turn was giving those keys to the church, and the gates of hell could not prevail when he put his hand to building the church. The victory has been achieved, the enemy has been subdued, and on the basis of that peace, the temple can begin to be built. And I have a feeling that maybe one of the reasons why the enemy hates the church so much is because it's actually a declaration of the victory of Jesus. Jesus has taken stones. If you can imagine yourself as being like part of a vast rock face, Jesus has come along and he has quarried you out from the rock face. And as Peter says, he has made you into a living stone that can be built in to this temple, into this dwelling place. And the very fact of your life and your existence as a living stone is a testimony to the defeat of Satan. He was cast down to the earth. He likes to think of the earth as his territory, but God has come down and he's reached into the earth and he's quarried you out. And he's made you to be a living stone that can be built into something that reveals the glory of God. And Satan hates the church because it's made up of people like you and me who are living demonstrations of Satan's defeat. We were once in the darkness of being buried underground as part of the rock, and we've been quarried out, and we've been built into something. And we're a testimony to the era of peace. The fact that Jesus has subdued the enemies. And so there was this period of preparation that went on for years as the enemies were being subdued. And then the time was right. And Solomon came to the throne, and this was the reign of peace. And as Solomon came to the throne, it still needed some more work to be done. Because that verse will tell you, chapter 6, verse 1, that it was in the 4th year of Solomon's reign that he actually began to build. The first 3 years were spent at the rock face, not at the temple site. But in the 4th year, something had happened, something was complete, and they were ready to start this building process. What had happened was that the stones had been prepared. Solomon didn't just start with a pile of rubble and decide that he was going to build. Those verses in chapter 5, verses 17 and 18, they speak about dressed stones, prepared stones. Stones that God had been working on over a period of time So that when Solomon said, right, now we're going to go for it, now we're going to begin to build, there were stones that were ready. They were ready to take their place. They weren't simply a pile of rubble. And in the timing of God, they were ready. You need to notice something about the preparation that God has gone into just to get you to be ready. As you look back over your life, think about all that God has done to make you ready to be built into that which He's doing. Because God had in mind an amazing structure. He had visualized something, I believe, that was pictured in Solomon's reign, but which was ultimately going to be seen way, way down in history. There was going to be something splendid that every stone was going to be necessary. Every stone had to be prepared to fit into this thing. Solomon had his blueprints, and the structure that he had in mind, it'll tell you in verse 2 of chapter 6, was 60 cubits long, which is 90 feet long. It was 30 feet wide. It was 45 feet high. And as you get down to the end of chapter 6 in verse 22, you see that the whole thing is going to be overlaid with gold. And can you imagine the splendor of something 60 foot long and overlaid with gold? God was preparing the stones to fit them into something that was going to be beautiful. You know, I have a feeling that we've got into the habit of knocking the church just a little bit. It's become kind of fashionable to knock the church. We've had so many years of hearing about the church. And that sort of moved by. And now the emphasis is much more on getting out and doing what we feel God's calling us to do. I just want to remind us this morning of the beauty of that which God is building corporately. A 60-foot long structure, 30 foot wide, 45 feet high, gold. That was impressive. And when in Haggai's day they came to rebuild the temple, when God's people came back from exile, the people would say, it's not going to compare with the splendor of Solomon's temple. And God said to them, don't you believe it? The glory of that which is to come is going to surpass that which has been. Solomon's temple, 60 feet by 30 feet by 45 feet of gold, that's nothing compared with what God is wanting to build in the earth. When you come into the book of Revelation and see the ultimate picture of what God is going to believe, the dimensions there compared with Solomon's temple are vast. God is building a city there, and I believe we are the city that is described there in Revelation in chapter 21. Do you know what the dimensions are of that city? In Revelation 21 it says verse 16, the city was laid out like a square, as long as it was wide, and he measured the city with the rod. And he found it to be 12,000 stadia in length. Now that doesn't mean anything to us, but if you look at the footnote, it says that's 1,400 miles long. 1,400 miles wide. 1,400 miles high. And this too is solid gold. That's what God meant when he said that the present temple, speaking of what was going on in Solomon's day or Haggai's day, was nothing compared to that which God was building. God wants to build a church, as Paul says to Ephesus, so that he can demonstrate to the world and to principalities and powers the magnificence of his wisdom. And you and I are stones that are being built into that declaration. This is a glorious thing that God is doing. Can you imagine 1,400 miles by 1,400 miles by 1,400 miles of solid gold? Let's just picture language to speak of the magnificence of that which God is building us into. We're being built into a temple fit for God's own dwelling place. And if that's your vision, you begin to see that you and I have to be significant. It's important what God has done in preparing us. He's not only just quarried us out, but He's made us into something that's going to fit into that incredible, beautiful structure that He's building that is called the church. And Solomon went to all sorts of trouble in order to get the stones that he's needing to do this work that he was doing here. In fact, it says in chapter 5 of 1 Kings in verse 13 that Solomon conscripted laborers. I don't like the idea of conscription too much, but in Solomon's day, that was what they did. They conscripted the laborers and they sent them out. And the arrangement was this: they had to go in shifts of 10,000 a month. Verse 14 will tell you, and they spent 1 month in Lebanon, 2 months at home, and then they'd go back to Lebanon again, and it would be a month of conscription. Solomon was determined to get this temple built. Reminds me of the parable that Jesus told. Remember when he said about there's people out there that have got to come into this banquet. And he commanded his servant to go out and to compel them to come in. And I believe that servant is the Holy Spirit. And God, by his Spirit, has gone out and he has compelled us to come in. The compulsion that he used was love, but he was determined to have you, and to have you to be part of this magnificent structure that he is building. And I want you to notice the description that Solomon has here of the stones. Verse 17, at the king's command they removed from the quarry large blocks of quality stone. Now, I just love that phrase. Large blocks of quality stone. That's God's description of you. You're a quality stone. Do you believe that? You are a quality stone. You're not just a piece of rubble. You're not just a stone that happened to be lying around somewhere. And God decided, okay, rather than just leave it in a heap, I'll pick it up, see what use I can make of it. In God's eyes, you are quality stone. Would you like just to say that? I am quality stone. Can you say that with me? I am quality stone. In God's sight, I am quality stone. Because God had a place in mind. He didn't just have dimensions 60 foot long, 30 foot wide. He had this structure so planned out that there was a little space here that needed a stone in it. And way back over there at the quarry site, they were making that stone to fit. And in this picture that God had, the blueprint of the temple, there was going to be a gap up there, was a slightly different shape. It needed certain qualities. And God saw you, and he pulled you out of the rock. And with his eyes, he saw what he could do with you by his grace. He saw that his power could be at work within you, and he could transform you by his grace, and he could take you out of just the rock face of humanity, and he could fit you right into that hole. And in his eyes, you're a quality stone, ordained from the beginning of time to fill that place that he had prepared, that he had planned for you. God saw quality in you. That's why he took the trouble to cut you out. That's why he took the trouble to work on you and to prepare you. Because these quality stones, they were not only quality in themselves, but they were prepared. They had to be dressed. They had to be got ready for the place that was in line for them. I don't know as we always appreciate what God is doing when he's preparing us and when he's chiseling away at us. But he has a place in mind. Remember what Jesus said in John 14? He says, don't let your hearts be troubled. If you believe in God, believe also in me. He says, I've got lots of rooms for you, lots of places for you. And he says, I go to prepare a place for you. And it's as if there's a place in the wall that is being prepared for you. And God is working on you and the place. And then in his timing, he brings them together. Paul said to Ephesus that we are God's workmanship, in order that we might walk in works that he has prepared beforehand for us to do. That combination, God prepares beforehand what he wants us to do, and he works on us. We're his workmanship. And so much of our lives is spent being prepared, but it's all to purpose. God has a place for you. God is working towards something in what He's doing in your life right now. You know, I'm grateful to be here. I believe that there's a place that's like a hole in the wall that God has brought me to fill. I believe that I wouldn't be here if I didn't feel that. I believe that God has been working on that over a period of years, preparing a hole that I'm going to fit in and that I am fitting in. That's the nice part of it. The other side of it was that, again, over that same period of years, God had to do some things with me so that when the time came, I would fit that hole. That's the bit that's harder to live with. I look back on the last few years of my life and I'm grateful to God for the way that He's led me. But I guess as good a description of them as any is, it's been like a period where I've been put in God's vice and I've been chiseled. That's what I've felt like, and there have been times when I've realized that and have appreciated it, and there have been lots of times when I've thought that might be what it was all about, but I certainly haven't appreciated it. But I'm glad for God's chiseling preparation, because I would never have fitted this hole 5 years ago. No way. But God has been at work, and the way that He's worked on me has been through circumstances, through people, through what I've had to go through within myself, through external things, but God has been working. Why has He been working? Because He sees me as He sees you as being a quality stone that is worth working on, that is worth preparing, because there's a hole somewhere that He's working towards, and you'll be fitted into it. But have a look at the building process here. Have a look at the way that God went about doing this. Just like to draw your attention to another verse in this chapter that I think is a very important verse. Chapter 6, verse 7 in 1 Kings. In building the temple, only blocks dressed at the quarry were used, and no hammer, chisel, or any other iron tool was heard at the temple site while it was being built. Have you ever been on a silent building site? I mean, can you imagine that? I mean, where we live at the moment, we've got a new house, and there are lots of new houses going up all around, and it's a bit like a building site. And the one thing that it is not is silent. You know, weather like this, you have to open all the windows, and as soon as you open all the windows, there's noise, because there are people working, there are trees coming down, there are yards being landscaped, there are houses going up, there's noise. But this building site was silent. And the reason that it was silent is this. All of the stones were prepared at the quarry. And when each stone was brought, they were ready just to be placed on top of the next one and beside this one. And there wasn't ever heard, can you imagine this, a building site without a hammer or a chisel or any other iron tool? Now, why did God put that little detail in there? I believe that what it says to us is that there is a time and a place for adjustment. There is a time and a place for God to do some chiseling, for God to do some preparatory work, to knock some rough edges off us. But the one place where that shouldn't happen is at the temple site. You know what Paul said? When you come together, that if there isn't love, then the whole thing makes a noise. It's like a big clanging cymbal. When you come together, that's at the temple site. That's not the place for getting out your chisel. This verse speaks to me about the fact that when God's people come together, we dare not have the noise of lovelessness, the clanging of iron. The place for that is at the quarry site. There is a proper time, there is a proper place for adjustment, for getting stones into shape so that they'll be able to take their place in the purposes of God. But that's not at the temple site, it's at the quarry. And the quarry is a reality for all of us. I believe that's the place where God deals with us. believe that's the place where God digs us out and works on us and prepares us and gets us ready to take our place. He's the one who shapes us. He's the one who dresses us. He's the one who prepares us. And I believe that shepherding care is part of the way that God does that. I believe that our interaction within the body of Christ is part of the way that God does that. But the temple site, the coming together of God's people, it has to be characterized by a freedom from the sound of the hammer. You know the sort of hammer that I mean? Sometimes it's a hammer that is prayer. You know how we can pray, but we can pray in such a way that really we're getting at somebody. Deep down we know that. In a sneaky sort of a way we hope that they know that. Or certainly that other people around know that. The chisel of criticism and harsh words that just shouldn't have a place at the temple site. Maybe the axe of gossip or whatever. There's a place for the preparation of the stones. But I want to just share something this morning that I feel is important. My problem is this. I have my place in the wall, and I like to think that I'm going to get you to fit in with me. And I believe that the chisel and the hammer that we use fits in with a verse that comes in James. Little verse in James in chapter 1. It says in verse 19 of James 1, "My dear brothers, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and especially this, slow to become angry, for man's anger does not bring about the righteous life that God desires." Man's anger does not bring about the righteous life that God desires. Now that means that if I get angry with you, even if it's because you're in the wrong, that won't make you get right. That's never God's way. My anger, my frustration, that's my problem. And it'll never work the righteousness of God in you. It's when I get angry with you and get out my hammer or my chisel or whatever and try to work on you, thinking that that'll make you fit better in the body of Christ. That's when we start to make the temple site a building site. And it doesn't work. Actually, those human tools prevent the building of the temple. The tools, I think, very often are the words that we use. Let me give you an illustration of what I mean. There was a time some years back when Ros, my wife, was going through a period where she was very often suffering from bad stomach pains. It was a sort of an indigestion type thing, but it seemed like night after night, or as the day wore on, sort of towards evening, this would begin to build up. And it was one of those situations, I guess some of you husbands are aware of this, the more you pray for your wife, the worse they get. And have you been there? It was one of those times. And I was faithfully praying for her, and she just wasn't getting any better. And I get frustrated at times like that, partly with her, partly with me, and partly with the situation, and that makes it worse in itself. And this was going on for a period of weeks. And very often we would go to bed at night and she would be in pain, and we'd just lie there and I would do my duty and pray over her and not have an awful lot of faith by that time, and turn over and hope that I would go to sleep, and very often she wouldn't. And one night God really spoke to us about arrows and swords from the Psalms. And the arrows and the swords were words. David was talking about arrows that were piercing him, swords that were draining away his strength. And those arrows, they were words. And it as I was just thinking about that one night as we lay in bed, it just hit me like a revelation that was as clear as anything, that the source of the pain was words. And as we began to talk about that and pray about it, the Lord revealed to us actually who we felt that it was that was directing the words. And we didn't know the details of it at the time, but subsequently we found out that that was the case. And as soon as I prayed for her release from the power of words, the pain went. Now that lesson has lived with us. That's a powerful thing. Negative words were being spoken. In fact, they weren't being directed specifically at her, but at us, and probably more at me than her. But she was the one who was feeling it. I want you to realize the power of the chisel and the axe. They're destructive. And they don't work the righteousness of God. They don't achieve what God is wanting to achieve in any case. Just let me give you a couple of references. I was working through the Psalms this last couple of weeks. I love David. I always seem to come back to him time after time after time. He was a great man of God and he was a great warrior. I mean, when you think of all of the victories that he won and all of the enemies that he faced, you know what struck me as I was just looking through the Psalms, very rarely did he ever seem to mention the battles that he got into. He often cried out to God for help, but most times it wasn't because there were enemies attacking him. I mean, he was surrounded at different times by the Philistines, the Ammonites, the Amalekites, a whole load of nations that were attacking him, but he never cried out to God, God, help me and deliver me from this nation or that nation. Again and again, when he cried out to God for help, do you know what he was asking for help from? It was to be delivered from words, and particularly from the words of his friends. Now, I went through all of the Psalms of David just to look this through. I've got a list of about, 20 or 30 of them, different Psalms that pick out that fact. Now, I haven't the time to give you all of them, but let me give you one or two of them. Psalm 31. David was concerned in Psalm 31. And look what he says in verse 9. Be merciful to me, O Lord, for I am in distress. Now what's his distress? It's not that he's being attacked by the Philistines or the Amalekites or any of these other nations. He says, my eyes grow weak with sorrow, my soul and my body with grief. My life is consumed with anguish and my years by groaning. My strength fails because of my affliction and my bones grow weak. So he is being attacked, he is being surrounded, but what is it? Look, verse 13. I hear the slander of many. That was what got to him. He could face a Goliath or a bear or an army or any of those things. But what got to him, he was hearing the slander of many. So he says, verse 15, deliver me from my enemies who pursue me. How do they pursue me? Verse 18, let their lying lips be silent. It was their words that were getting to him. Have a look at Psalm 41. The Lord is, again, his deliverer. Look at this, verse 3. The Lord will sustain him on his sickbed and restore him from his bed of illness. And this is David's prayer. And I believe that this is what Roz was going through, which is why I shared that. But look what the enemies were doing. Verse 5. My enemies say of me in malice, when will he die and his name perish? And it was that got to him, the malice in the words of his enemies. Verse 6, whenever one comes to see me, he speaks falsely while his heart gathers slander. Then he goes out and spreads it abroad. All my enemies whisper together against me. That's powerful. The thing that troubled David was not his enemies taking out their sword. The thing that troubled David was his enemies whispering. Psalm 55. Listen to my prayer, O God. Do not ignore my plea. Hear me, answer me. My thoughts trouble me, and I am distraught at the voice of my enemy. Verse 9, this is his prayer. Confuse the wicked, O Lord, confound their speech. And he goes on to say in verse 11, in verse 12 rather, if an enemy were insulting me, I could endure it. If a foe were raising himself against me, I could hide from it. But it is you, a man like myself, my companion, my close friend, with whom I once enjoyed sweet fellowship as we walked together in the house of God. That's what got him. Words. Not from the Philistines, but from his brother. Now, as I say, I've got loads more references. I'm not going to take time to go through them. But can you hear the impact of what I'm saying? You see, David couldn't build the temple because he lived in a period of war. And as I was following that thought through, this is what struck me. His battle wasn't with the external foes. It was internal. His enemies were on the inside. And their weapons were their words. And there wasn't peace. So the temple couldn't be built. Now, how are we to handle this? I want to conclude on a fairly practical note. We have this dilemma. God is putting us in the wall, and there are times when you and I feel that the stones around us in the wall, there's some things that need adjustment there. I mean, you're like me, are you? That there are some people that you don't find it easy to fit in alongside. And you wonder why, and you wonder how. I think the first thing to notice is that God has placed every one of us in the body as He chose. That means that He's chosen to put me here and you there. And He has ordained for us to be together. We don't always have a choice over that. He chooses who goes where. And He puts us together, and very often He has a sneaky little ulterior motive. That there's something that He wants to work out because of that bringing together of stones. But how do we handle that dilemma? There's me and there's you. And I'm a easygoing sort of a fella. I think I'm the most... I mean, it's obvious. I mean, we all have this view of ourselves, don't we? That I'm easy to get along with. I can't imagine anybody having any problems getting along with me. I mean, I'm just me. But it's always the other person. There's something about them that is harder. Let me try and apologize for anybody who's listening on a tape, but I'm going to use a visual aid, which doesn't clarify it too much on a tape, but it does help for those of us who are here. Now, that's me. Now, I'm a nice, neat sort of a brick. There's nothing strange about me. I mean, just find any gap and I will fit there, you see. And this is you. Now, the thing about you is that you're not quite as sort of regular as me. And you got this sort of funny bit that sort of sticks out. Can you sort of visualize that? Now, we always have this idea about other people. There's something about them that sort of sticks out and jars. And when God starts to try and put us together, that's the uncomfortable bit. It's the thing in them that doesn't sort of sit comfortably with me. Now, I'm sure every one of you, right now, you can visualize who the you is. There's somebody in your mind, maybe a number of people in your mind. And you can even visualize what that bit that sticks out and grates against you is. Now, how do we handle it? Because God says that He has prepared these stones to fit into the wall. I think that the human response is this. It's very obvious. You get out the chisel and you get out the hammer. I mean, it's obvious. We have a fitting problem here. How are me and you going to fit? It's obvious. All we do, if we chop that bit off, we don't have a problem anymore. We just fit. Now, that's our attitude. If I can just adjust that little bit in my brother or in my sister, we're going to fit. And I get to work on that. If I'm spiritual, the way that I'll get to work on it is in prayer. Lord God, will you change him? Now, you want to watch prayers like that? Because Jesus says that the measure with which you judge gets you on the back of the neck. God has a habit of doing the adjusting in a different kind of a way. But sometimes the chisel that we use is prayer. And it sounds kind of spiritual. I would suggest it isn't all that spiritual. Other times we're a little bit more blunt about it and we speak harsh words. We speak critical words. That is not God's way. That's doing it at the temple site. God says, I want you to do it at the quarry. How do you do it at the quarry? Well, here's me. I'm still a regular, ordinary sort of a fella. You know what Paul says? Have a look in Philippians 2, and this is really what I'm saying. It's an attitude that I'm talking about here. Philippians chapter 2, this is the attitude that I'm seeking to portray. Philippians chapter 2 verse 3 says, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, but in humility consider others better than yourselves. Now how do you do that? Well, you recognize that you have a problem. There's you and there's him. If you consider others better than yourself, what you're doing is you're saying, God, we have a problem here, and I'm going to assume it's me rather than him. Now, does that sound too simple? But that's what it means to count others as better than yourselves. It means to assume that the problem's in you and not in him. Yes, we do have a fitting problem. God is trying to place these two bricks together at the building site and they don't seem to be fitting. I believe that the response that God wants is this: Lord, will you take me back to the quarry? Because we don't seem to fit together here. And I figure you're going to need to change me. With those two stones together, you end up with a much stronger joint than if you just have two that meet head on. If you're willing to let the adjustments come in you, you end up with a stronger joint. I believe that that's what God means when he says through Paul, consider others as better than yourselves. Assume that the problem is within you, that the fitting has to happen back at the quarry. Lord God, take me back to Calvary, because when you took me out, in order to build me into the temple, something wasn't quite complete in the preparation that you did in me, because I'm having a hard time fitting into the temple. Will you work on me and make me fit? Let me illustrate what I mean. Remember a time when I was a teenager, I went off one summer with Youth with a Mission. YWAM were having an outreach at the Munich Olympic Games, and I was a sort of young, zealous student, and this was going to be exciting. We were going to go to the Olympic Games in Munich, and we were going to evangelize. And there was a group, I guess about 4,000 people, I can't quite remember, but it was a big group of people from all over the world that were gathering under the umbrella of YWAM to do this big outreach at the Olympic Games site in Munich. Now, there was an English contingent that was leaving, and I guess there was probably about 150 of us going from England. And we were all excited, and we were given a time to arrive at Heathrow Airport in London, and we were to fly out to Munich, and we all arrived in the lounge, and this was the first time we'd met one another. Most of us didn't know each other at all. It was just a group of people from all over the place coming together to evangelize. And you know how it is, when you get into that sort of situation, you're mixing a little bit, trying to meet people, getting to know one another, see who you're going to get along with, and working out who you're not going to get along with. Well, in this lounge, we just had a half an hour or something, and I began to talk with people, and immediately there was one fellow that I knew I wasn't going to get along with. Been in those situations, you know them immediately. And this was one fella like that. I could see that we were not going to get along. And I thought, well, that's no problem. There's going to be 5,000 of us out there. I don't need to see too much of this particular fella. And I moved on to the next person. See, I'm a quiet sort of a guy, and he was, in my view, a loud, outspoken sort of a person, and that was the bit that sort of stuck out and got at me. Anyway, we flew off and we arrived at this big castle that YWAM had taken over just outside Munich, and we were put into lodgings there, and the next day we were gathering together to be given our instructions, and they said, well, there's so many people here and the transportation is limited. What we're going to do is we're going to split you down the middle so that like half of you will go into Munich to evangelize one day and the other half will stay back and do the chores around the castle and the cooking and cleaning and spend time in prayer and in teaching, and then the next day you'll swap it around and go back again. And so we were split down the middle that day. And you know, the first thing that I noticed was that this fellow that I had spotted at the airport was in my half. I mean, there were 2,500 people that were going into Munich every day, and if he'd been over there, I would never have had to see him again. But he was in my half, and I just noticed that. Anyway, it was our turn to stay behind, and we were back there, and they were working out how they were going to administrate the whole thing. And they decided that it would be a good thing to split this thing up into manageable groups of about 100, 120 people to work together. And you know what the first thing I noticed when they started to do that? There was one fella, it was this same chap. His name was Kenneth, and he was in my 120. And I thought, Lord, did you have to do that? Because now I knew that every day we'd like be going in on the same bus and work in the same area. Anyway, they then come up with this bright idea that it would be good for us to begin to relate together and to pray in small groups every day. So they broke us down into about 8 or 10 so that we could spend this whole period of outreach really fellowshipping closely together. And Kenneth was in my group. So every day you'd have to pray together, and I knew we were going to do that. And every day we would have the city of Munich split up into areas, and our little group of 8 would always go to the same area. If we had open airs to do, we would do it. If we had coffee bar work to do, we'd be in the same coffee bar. Whatever it was, we were going to be together. And the first day we were to go out, there was the 8 of us, and we had our little patch assigned to us, and it was in an area, English Garden, which was an area that was actually being used at that time by, all the hippies and the dropouts just landed there, just while there was the festival atmosphere going on, obviously, as the Olympic Games were on. There was a lot of drugs, there was a lot of drink, and they didn't have anywhere to stay, didn't have any money, and that was our assignment. We were to go into that park area, and we were to see what the Lord would do there. So we went in all fired up, and the leader of our little group of 8 or 10 or whatever it was, very spiritual man, knew how to work things out biblically, decided that the best way to evangelize in that area was 2 by 2. And there was Kenneth, and there was me. What were you doing, God? 5,000 people, and he put the 2 of us together. And the 2 of us went out that morning, and we decided in our own way that I would speak to this fella and he'd speak to that man. They were sort of together in the same general area, and I sat down and I was full of enthusiasm. First morning out, this guy was high on drugs and all sorts of other things. Hadn't eaten for a week, I discovered when I was talking with him. He had no money, nothing. Well, at least that's what he said. And I was fresh and enthusiastic, and I'd got my picnic that had been given to me back at the castle, and this was first thing in the morning, and you're going to evangelize somebody. I'll do the best thing I know how. I'll give him my lunch. Magnanimous gesture like that, he's bound to get saved and be impressed, and he sat there and ate my lunch, and he wasn't interested in anything that I said. And we talked, I guess, for an hour or two, and then Kenneth was over there and he was talking with this other guy, and they didn't seem to be getting anywhere, and we decided we'd just swap over. Kenneth came across and he spoke to the chap that I'd been with and had eaten my lunch, and I was hungry by this time and I didn't have any lunch, and I was trying to talk to this other one, and I looked out at the corner of my eye and I saw Kenneth praying with this other chap. And he just led him to the Lord. And I realized something in that what I thought was abrasive in Kenneth's character, outspoken, loud, that was just what God needed to get through to that young man in a way that I could never communicate. I mean, I could give my lunch, and in a proud sort of a way like to think that maybe that was part of sowing some seeds and one day I shall get some glory for giving up my lunch. But really, God needed him and his character and his personality. And I had to learn to accommodate that. And actually, if you put the two of us together, there was quite a balance there. His abrasiveness, hopefully my thoughtfulness, planning and thinking and stuff like that. And God designed it to put these two bricks together. And what I had to learn to do over that period of outreach was to say, God, will you adjust me? Because I couldn't argue anymore that the hand of God was on his life. And I couldn't argue anymore that his character was something that was a problem, because it was actually that which won over that young man in the park. And my praying had to change. No longer, God, will you change that loud, outspoken fellow? How can he be any use to you all the while he's like that? It had to be, Lord, will you adjust me so that I can fit in and we can work together? Because you see, when this Temple of Solomon's was built, the amazing thing about it was this, just to conclude back at 1 Kings 6. Do you know what Solomon did? Got all these marvellous stones together, and then he boarded them up with cedar wood. And then he covered the whole thing with gold. Every stone was important. Every stone was vital. But you know, the impressive thing was not stones, but gold. And you and I have to be prepared to take our place in the body in such a way that at the end of the day, it's not us that's seen. You are important, because if you're taken out of the wall, there's a hole there. The whole thing is insecure. But at the end of the day, when God builds this structure, he's going to cover it with cedar, overlay it with gold, and that's what's going to impact the world. The splendor of the whole thing, not the uniqueness of your individuality. And it's thinking of yourself more highly than you ought to think. To have that view that thinks, I'm the important piece in the jigsaw. God is wanting an attitude that is willing to be lost in the whole, covered up, overlaid with gold, and the world will see something that is splendid. It's interesting, when you come over to Revelation, you get the same picture of gold, but it's gold as pure as crystal. And it becomes suddenly transparent gold. Because you see, the glory of the Lord is going to fill this temple, and the world is only going to see it if it's transparent. And the only thing that will stop the world from seeing the glory of the Lord in the temple is you and me, if we hang on to our uniqueness as individual stones. I believe that the Lord wants us to learn how to fit in. I have no problem with openness, speaking the truth in love to one another. But the attitude that I'm talking about is counting the other better than yourself and being willing to be part of the whole.
Hope you have enjoyed this message and that it has enriched your life. If you would like to see our entire list of life-building messages by various Holy Spirit-inspired speakers, go to the Video Sermon tab on our Free Bible Study Lessons website. That is www.freebiblestudylessons.com. May God richly bless you as you study His Word.